you're calling in from. I am in Orlando right now in my A-frame, and I wanted to also say hi to everybody in the chat. So go ahead and do that if you want. I wanted to just note that CPF is you are welcome to join us at CPF anytime. We have membership available, and we have a big conference coming up June 8th through 10th, and there are benefits for membership if you sign up now. You can go to our website at californiapreservation.org for all of that information. And then also, if you feel inclined, if you are also welcome to donate to CPF. All of your donations actually help us keep these programs free for the public. And we've had so much fun. John disappeared, or I would say, right, John? So we've had over 40 programs, and there he comes back, right, John? We've had over 40 programs in the last few months, and we've really enjoyed getting to know all of you. And the reason I say this is because our last webinar before the conference starts, we're going to take a little break so we can get prepared and have a really great show for you all when we start this conference. I wanted to thank the sponsor of this series, a 1970s series, U.S. Modernist Radio, and also the Cultural Landscape Foundation for being our partner in this series. And speaking of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, I wanted to welcome our first speaker, Charles. How are you?
Great to see you, Christine. I'm a little whiplash from you and John. God, that was like record time.
We like
Be
to
done.
go. We like to roll in these real fast. So, Charles, welcome and thank you so much for coming today. Take it away. Let's see what you got.
Super. Well, I'll share my screen. Here we go. Hello. And let's go right to from beginning. Great. Okay, let me just minimize this. It's wonderful to be here. John and Gretchen and Chris, thank you. I had great fun last week, and it's nice to be back again with my pal Nate Cormier from Rios. And we're going to talk about post-war plazas. I thought I would just actually put this on my landing page. These are all views that I've just sort of had and experiences in San Francisco and Los Angeles. The one on the right I took last year at the Standard. Actually, no, that's the earlier photograph by Sasaki Walker. It has now been redesigned, and with the exception of the Herbert Baer sculpture, the plaza's quite changed. On the left-hand side, another Sasaki Walker project at Bank of America. And of course, for those folks here from San Francisco today, as a shout out to you, here's Transamerica Redwood. What these places all have in common is none of them are designated, and they're all subject to eradication or significant change. I thought if we're going to talk about plazas, we should actually start today with a shared definition of what a plaza is, and what better place to start than at Wikipedia. A public square, marketplace, or similar open space in a built-up area. And when I saw this second sentence, I thought about the Will and Grace episode where Jack did a gay spelling bee and had to use the word taffeta in a sentence, and he said, "I like taffeta." This is similar. They brought fancy bridal wear at the plaza. Bet you didn't know you have to go to the plaza for bridal wear. But nevertheless, if you go to the Cultural Landscape Foundation's definition for a plaza, and I won't read that today, but because this is the 1970s and beyond that we're looking at, and I will slip in a few places that are a little before, I think what's important to recognize is that the 70s, didn't just bring in sort of mashups like Reese's Peanut Butter Cups and Razzles. I always was confused whether it was a gum or a candy, that this is the period of the Park Plaza hybrid, which was ushered in by M. Paul Friedberg in 1974 with PD Plaza in Minneapolis, which I'll come back to later, which was listed on the National Register in 2013 and underwent a successful rehabilitation as of late in 2019. If you go to our website, for those of you not familiar with tclf.org, you'll see a great number of plazas in our database, and they're organized by typologies, designer, geographic location. But what I want to do today in sort of setting the stage for the work that we'll see is look at how we measure success when we're looking at plazas from this era. And I also want sort of a shout out to the idea that, sorry, I can't resist showing this because I took this on the day that Joe Biden was announced as the president of the United States, because one of the issues here I think that we often don't talk about when we talk about plazas from the recent past is the cultural context. What events have taken place in these places over time and what that means to managing change. So for today, I'd like to set the stage in answering the question of how I measure success. And I will do this through the National Register of Historic Places, 7 aspects of integrity. So when we're looking at plazas, they have from left to right at the top, low, medium, high integrity. Looking at, condition on the top, low, medium, high, and then integrity on the side. So for example, bottom left, low integrity, poor condition, Love Plaza in Philadelphia, recently redesigned by Hargraves, having the carrying capacity for substantive change. In the middle, Boston City Hall, a plaza that's currently being redesigned by Sasaki. And on the right, as I mentioned earlier, PV Plaza, high integrity, significant design, less carrying capacity for change. So as we look at the different examples today, what I'd like to do is put out my foundational considerations. What's the contextual considerations when managing change in post-war plazas? So first of all, context is both the physical setting and the historical, the sort of how this fits like a Russian nesting doll with other plazas over time. Is the plaza a rare extant work by a designer, or does it have a significant association with historic events? Is the plaza a progenitor of a typology like PV? Is it the work of an exemplar? Is it locally significant, National Register, NHL, or World Heritage? And finally, does the plaza represent a rare or intact example of continuity and contiguity with its building envelope? Now, in some cases, there's an increasing amount of scholarship that's readily available. This is Mellon Plaza, for example, where you see within, I would say, the core of the plaza, if you can see my cursor, this has undergone a very detailed restoration rehabilitation. If you look at the view in the foreground here, you can see that what had been a planted area has become now a cantilevered viewing terrace. So we see a project that has really honored the bone structure and the historic integrity of the earlier design by John Simons. This is work that was done by Heritage Landscape by the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, very successful project. I think this image speaks for itself in San Francisco. I took this on my last visit. You can see how a seminal tree that was specified by Lawrence Halprin for its sculptural qualities, for its references to the High Sierras, has now been replaced with a festival of hens and chicks and this memorial placard. I would say this is not successful. We have projects that have been destroyed from the era that we're looking at today. This is the second largest cast iron district in America after Soho. This was the work of Jones and Jones, and in particular, the pavilion that was designed by Ilsa Jones was raised for a new sort of flexible use space driven by programmable activities. But there are many spaces that don't have significant design integrity, that are lacking in terms of its condition, like Nolan Plaza in Des Moines. Ken Smith underwent a detailed analysis of the Sasaki design that had been done earlier in managing change in his rehabilitation scheme. I mentioned Love Plaza earlier, which has undergone a major new overhaul and has also addressed the issue of ADA accessibility, as you could see here, which was quite challenging. And there are other plazas such as this one in San Diego by the architect Samuel Hamill at the Civic Center, which is not really a significant design and would invariably, I believe, have the carrying capacity for significant change. What about those plazas that just undergo change and they're not considered by things like local review, landmark commissions? At Citicorp in New York, much to my surprise, the celebrated space that was designed by Hideo Sasaki's office was eradicated, radically changed, and there was no evaluation of its integrity or significance by the New York City Preservation Landmarks Commission. I just happened to be in the city one day when the bulldozers were going, and I quickly sent off a video to Audrey Walks at the Architect's newspaper, and you could see the surprise in my voice in rendering this plaza tabula rasa. And here are some views today. I think on a happier note, to contrast the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission with the city of Los Angeles, this is really through the leadership of the Los Angeles Conservancy and Adrian Scott Fine. The Union Bank Plaza in Los Angeles avoided a similar fate. The plaza was designated. This is, of course, the work of Garrett Ekbo, probably one of his most intact landscapes, and underwent a fairly successful rehabilitation effort recently that honored the bone structure and the earlier design. It's interesting to note here, the repositioning project provided the opportunity for Union Bank Plaza to see, quote, in a new light while still maintaining the historic characteristics that make it so unique. So it's wonderful to see projects like this where the historic core, in fact, has been retained and the plaza has been locally designated. Of course, this idea of authenticity is central to all of these plazas, both in the US and even through the World Heritage lens. Here you see form and design, materials and substance, use and function, traditions, location and setting, spirit and feeling, all very similar to our own 7 aspects of integrity. And so with that, what I'd like to do with the rest of my time is kind of give you a quick windshield survey of the 7 aspects of integrity through a visual survey of plazas. So in terms of integrity, we can see projects like Constitution Plaza in Hartford, Connecticut, which is ironically contiguous with the SHPO office, likely eligible for National Register listing, and among the first corporate roof gardens constructed after the Second World War. High degree of integrity. In Canada, the first heritage landscape as a cultural landscape and post-war work of modernism, the Queen's Park complex in Toronto by Sasaki and Strong has been locally and designated feeding the World Heritage Guidelines. The first Lawrence Halpern landscape to be designated in its own right, this was the Bicentennial Project from 1976. It opened officially in 1980 and is undergoing a major renewal as we speak, is Heritage Park, which was listed on the National Register in 2010 for significance in landscape architecture. So let's look at the 7 aspects of integrity. First, location, the place where the plaza was constructed or where the historic event occurred. For the New Yorkers, think about Noguchi's Cube and SOM's project in Lower Manhattan. This went to the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in the last couple of years because there were going to be a number of additions that were added to the plaza, ignoring the symmetry of the ensemble. This was really in response to the food trucks that collect here. Happily, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in this case recognized that the spatial volume, the asymmetry of the plaza, did in fact contribute to the overall integrity of the historic design. A project that's actually going forward, probably one of the great postmodernist plazas in America, the work of the late Jim Reeves of the SWA group and the artist Robert Glenn. Again, the plaza as plinth and again SOM, in this case working with SWA. Here are some historic images from its earlier days. I took this from the higher elevation restaurant just a couple of years ago. And this is the new design that is now going to have groundbreaking and going forward, partially in response to the commercial development across the street. So I'm going to not say anything more than this. I will just ask those that are here today, how would you measure success when the plaza is the plinth, but we're also trying to accommodate a space for people in a fairly hot climate? As I mentioned earlier, the integrity of setting, the physical environment, the borrowed view, for example, at the Seagram's Plaza has a very high degree of integrity. And we can also see the work that was done here right down to the weeping willows that were replaced with ginkgo trees. So the spatial volume, the integrity of setting have all been respected in the rehabilitation of the plaza. In the case of the Tanner Fountain, this is Peter Walker in SWA 1984, probably one of Peter Walker's most celebrated projects. This space has undergone a major rehabilitation surrounding this. Whoops, sorry. And so the challenge here is the integrity of setting has been drastically altered for the Tanner Fountain. Continuing on to design, This is a before image of PV Plaza, and we can see here a very high degree of integrity. The nodal space was created due largely to the contiguous Nicollet Mall, which Halpern had designed in 1967. This was really the gathering space that was created along the mall. Hardy Holtzman Pfeiffer were the architects of the orchestra hall. And we can see here, although the space was in diminished condition in 2010, it still possessed a high degree of integrity. And like a lot of projects from this era, it had to be addressed in terms of providing ADA and other contemporary amenities. Here we can see the revitalized, rehabilitated fountain in 2019. This is the work of Shane Cohn with James Garland from Fluidity Design, and Linnea Tillett are these fabulous night views, who was the lighting consultant. I think that this is an example of really working with the bone structure, the visual and physical framework of the earlier design, and really respecting the historic materials to the highest degree possible. Note that the basin is still the same outline. It is a scrim today, still providing the same reflectivity. Even right down to the original light fixtures have been restored and rehabilitated. Continuing on looking at materiality, this is another recent rehabilitation project. This is the Piazza de Italia in New Orleans by Charles Moore. And you can see here a very high level of degree of maintaining the historic materials as part of that rehabilitation effort. Continuing on, looking at the topic of workmanship, the physical evidence of the crafts of a particular cultural people. This is a highly unusual fountain for Lawrence Halpern. It's also a highly unusual project in the state of Missouri as really the most fully realized project by Halpern. It was quite early, 1974. It sat in a historic district that was only known for its commercial architecture, and so its period of significance ended in 1920. The project was going to be raised. The image that I'm showing you on the top right was going to be the new design. The fountain that you see in the left-hand side of this rendering, you can see it here, that was going to be rehabilitated, but the space was going to be radically altered. Happily, the Cultural Landscape Foundation partnered with the National Trust in making an appeal in a 106 process that in fact the landscape was eligible for listing, and that it should not be a wholesale demolition of the space. I'm happy to report that it was listed in 2010, and underwent a successful rehabilitation of the fountain. I couldn't resist I know we're looking at the 70s and beyond, and I thought I would just push the envelope a little bit here and show this space in Pittsburgh. It's the work of Dan Kiley, one of his last public, I would say, capstone projects with the artist Louise Bourgeois. This was done for Pittsburgh's downtown cultural district. Kiley has a great number of National Historic Landmarks, and I would argue that even though this project doesn't hit the 50-year threshold for designation as the work of a master, I think that projects could really go right to the 90s and push our comfort zone in this conversation today. And then I'll conclude by looking at feeling and association. And in particular, because of the conversation, for those of you that were here last week, and we looked at the plaza at the UN fountain in San Francisco at the Civic Center, that feeling and association can be these ephemeral things. In this particular case, the animating qualities of plants by Uma van Sweden on the University of Minnesota campus. And you can see from an earlier design contrasted with the sadness of the loss of those plants today and the loss of those feelings that are conjured up by the historic design intent of the plantings. But also I wanted to show these images from UN Plaza that were taken after its rehabilitation in the early 2010s. And this idea that somehow that this project would still have integrity if the animating qualities of water, which was central to Halpern's ideas of choreography of both and movement of both people and water and the theatrical quality of urban plazas. There was a suggestion made last week that somehow the current proposals for something that was far more static and performative in terms of a wetland would satisfy that design intent. And I would suggest that when we think about the aspects of integrity, the feeling and the association, in particular, when it comes to landscape, is absolutely critical. And just to contrast that, and it's very difficult for me to even show these pictures today. On the bottom here, you'll see photographs that I took just 2 weeks ago. This is the newly opening World War I Memorial in Washington, D.C. The 56-foot long, 11-foot high sculptural frieze won't be installed for 3 years. You can see the rendering of it there, but you can see and you can contrast the difference from the top view, where you see this dual purpose feature that was both a lagoon-like pool with flowering aquatic plants that became a skating rink in the wintertime, and its animating qualities of being part of the theatrical landscape and the setting. And you contrast that with the bottom view. The image that you see on the bottom right-hand side is the water wall that's on the backside of this sculpture. But as you can see, it only occupies a small portion of this space. And so the question I want to conclude with in these last images is when we look at the idea of measuring success, both in terms of managing change, if I dare to use the P word, historic preservation, and urban design, what if you're a Washingtonian? This was one of those rare downtown spaces. Will you still want to go have lunch in a space that was highly animated and celebratory, that is now by design quite solemn? And then finally, I just thought I would end by giving a shout out to the firm Agency and Gina Ford. This is a project also, 1991. This was Angela Donaja, who had been in Lawrence Halprin's employment until the 1970s, was the design lead on a number of celebrated projects, including Freeway Park and the Ira Keller Fountain. This is one of her rare fountain designs on the East Coast, Thomas Polk Park. There was an RFP issued for this landscape. And I'm happy to report that Gina Ford and company, including, again, James Garland, the idea was to recognize the contributing qualities of water as an animating feature in managing change, and the rehabilitation scheme that is now advancing understands the value of Donaja's design and the animating qualities of water in the space. And then finally, I want to just conclude by the idea of the events that took place in these spaces. And although when we look at plazas from the recent past, they can be spaces that are laced with incredible cultural narratives that are great opportunities for storytelling and placemaking today. So as a prelude to Nate coming forward, I just wanted to come back to my matrix from some of the examples that I gave today to test out this idea of condition and integrity, and how it informs how we manage change and the carrying capacity for change. I think this is all about understanding the great bone structure of any given landscape and putting it within its larger historical and physical context. For those of you that are interested, and I can put this in the chat room, the sort of 7 aspects and the sort of major outline of this presentation, we've actually posted it on our website under Rehabilitating Post-War Plazas Primer. Thank you all.
Thank you, Charles. Nate, it's up to, I wanted to introduce Nate Cormier. Go ahead, Nate.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Christine and the foundation. Thank you, Charles. Always educational following you. I'm going to share my screen here and get you back to the start. And boom. All right. I'm not going to talk about this project in South Park, but I just always like to sneak my kids into all my presentations. So they're particularly well behaved in that image. So that's me. I think what I'd like to offer is more of an in the trenches view. Charles comes at it from an advocacy and really from a perspective of optimizing these values that we hold dear. And as a landscape practitioner, and I'm at Rios, and I'll tell you a little bit about Rios, but just the perspective I want to bring is balancing the preservation, the cultural landscape, the deep sense of history with all of the other aspects of urban design, placemaking, landscape architecture, which make a place successful. So I'm with Rios. We're a multidisciplinary design house based in Los Angeles, but since the pandemic, our people have spread all over the world. We've got now almost 180 people, and folks are as far flung as Milan and Beijing, Bozeman, Portland, Austin, and something that started with Mark Rios in the late 80s is just really grown into an amazing design family. It's really an unusual collection of thinkers, very diverse and curious about the boundaries of our disciplines. And so we have things ranging from skyscrapers and theaters to parks and private gardens and even fashion and tableware. And what really brings us all together, this very diverse bunch of us, is storytelling. It's really understanding, being curious about a place and trying to reveal and amplify what makes a place really special, what makes it really unique, and how do we bring that to more audiences. So what I'm going to share with you first is, before going into a deep dive on a couple of projects that have been instructive for me as a practitioner, is if you think about that matrix that Charles introduced, sometimes we have projects that, at least from a preservation standpoint, are fairly easy. They may have lots of other really complicated things to make them successful projects, but in this case, for example, a new Central Park for Palm Springs, while it has an interesting history, the site, it was the original site of the Desert Inn. Nellie Kaufman, who's kind of thought of as the mother of Palm Springs, or at least its kind of latest identity in terms of hospitality. This was her site. But when we arrived, it was just a pile of dirt. A mall had been demolished. And so there wasn't a lot to wrestle with in terms of immediate site preservation issues. And so from our standpoint, with this, really trying to understand the intrinsic landscape, what is special eternally about this place that has always drawn from the indigenous people to early settlers like this Bill Pester is kind of the original proto-hippie beatnik settlers, and on into Jim Morrison and others who come to this place seeking something, health, wellness, finding themselves. How do we give future generations that special quality of Palm Springs? And so this is a project that's under construction right now. Again, this is an example of when we're addressing a site that has a lot of freedom because there's low integrity in terms of any remaining residue of past uses of the site. Another example, and this, if the first one was low integrity, we'll say this one is maybe low significance. This was a plaza called Jones Plaza in downtown Houston, and designed in the 90s by an architecture firm in town, Bricker and Kennedy Architects, and almost immediately not beloved. There was a Jordi Tollett was the local politician or events commissioner who was behind putting this plaza in, and it almost immediately took on the nickname of Jordi's Toilet. And so I hope he's not on the call or anything, but just to say, this was a project where we were coming into it and there was not a big uproar of preservation spirit saying, we've got to keep what's here, it's intact, we want you to like just make it more of what it already is. And so in this case, we took inspiration from its immediate context of the performing arts venues that surrounded it, and as a subtle homage to Lawrence Halpern, thinking about how those performing arts are also the social art of public space, and how we can encourage flows of people into and through this new green heart for downtown Houston, and which inspired this space of intersections and intentional choreography of both the performing arts that can now come outside of these venues that surround the space, as well as the day-to-day interactions of an emerging downtown residential population, office workers, all these different audiences, really exposing them to what's great about the theater district in this new public space. So those are examples of not having to wrestle with these issues. And now I'll give you one that is, and those are both under construction. So hopefully next time we present all this, Charles, we'll have some, be able to see the outcomes of those. But this is one that's really hot for us right now. This is for us, a project in downtown Denver, originally designed by Lawrence Halprin. I would say, using Charles's metric, high in significance and currently low in integrity. And so it leads to a lot of questions about, as designers, balancing all those different stakeholder interests. How do we program the space? How do we deal with some of the urban design challenges of the way that it was made? And so I went to Charles and I said, Charles, got this really, hard puzzle here. What are some thoughts? And something that I'll share some examples of, but he really encouraged me to go back and talk with Mark Rios and Bob Hale and some of the folks who had worked on projects with some similar challenges in the past. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. This one is still in the works, but I want you to understand the projects I'm going to show you in downtown Los Angeles are helping us to try to thread the needle or walk the tightrope between what was special about that original design and how do we incorporate some of these contemporary needs and issues that are real as well in terms of urban design, activation, and being a successful public space in a modern city. So just to share a little bit more about the original design, these are some of Halprin's early sketches. It was intended to be a catalyst for redevelopment after a period of urban renewal where, for me, unfortunately, a neighborhood that had a lot of richness and its own sense of types of cultural landscapes in terms of mixed income, mixed use, walkable, those types of neighborhoods all over our country were deemed blighted and wiped out in the name of progress. But so Halprin is called to town. They said, make us this amazing park, very plaza-like park that will be a signal that we're on the mend. We're building something special here. And what was really impressive about his design, and there's all sorts of things about the particular materiality and forms and things, but the overall thing that strikes me as really impressive about the work was this flow of spaces from block to block down the middle of the 3 blocks. And the way he choreographed, his wife was a dancer and a choreographer, and he wrote extensively and sketched and scored how people move through public space. But it was this like alternating moments of compression and then expansive places to gather and the sound of water that would lure you around the corner to something you can't see. And just that sense of movement in public space was really powerful. And so we have to wrestle with now not having all of that intact. In the 2000s, another firm came and removed about 80% of it in the interest of trying to add greater flexibility and functionality to it. But while some artifacts remain, what was really broken in that redesign was the loss of the flow. And so thinking, as our design team is now working on it, trying to find this balance of what's left. Is there some of that should remain a part of its future? But more importantly, and I think some of those words, the feeling, the association, those types of things that Charles spoke about, how do we bring back the flow? And wouldn't that be something that would honor the past as well as allow for its new functionality and programming that is really important for contemporary public spaces. So that's the kind of those are the kinds of questions that we're wrestling with as designers. And as with Charles's encouragement, looking back at a couple of the most significant public spaces that Rios has designed and talking to the people who were on the ground at the time about how they did that is informing our contemporary practice. So this is, of course, Grand Park in downtown Los Angeles. You can see that it really weaves together our civic core, anchored by City Hall at the base of the park, as well as our cultural core with the Music Center Plaza Disney Concert Hall and Broad and all that up at the top of Bunker Hill. A little bit of background, another story of urban renewal, mixed income, older neighborhood that was demolished in the name of putting up office towers and all of what was new in the middle of the century. And for some reason, the urban renewal guys always had these pointers and their grand visions. But so they said this is going to be a modern day Acropolis on Bunker Hill and cascading down the slope, this new civic center mall. And a series of ideas that percolated from the 20s all the way through, culminated in the 60s with a 12-acre, what they call the Civic Center Mall, designed by Ralph Cornell with his firm Cornell, Bridgers and Troller. And now fast forward to the 2000s when the related company, as part of their larger redevelopment that's going on, contributed to create this updated park for all of Los Angeles County. And Mark Rios and the team were hired. And the condition, as you can imagine, a lot of things had deteriorated. The materials that were being used in the 60s weren't necessarily holding up. There was, with the broader type of planning that was done at that time, where these sort of single uses were concentrated, there was a real lack of connectivity between the park and residential areas and populations. And a lot of the spaces just didn't support the ways that people wanted to use public space that in the 2000s and nowadays. So they were not very flexible for performances, large gatherings. They were more ceremonial in purpose, more scenically driven than they were intended for a lot of different ways of occupying the spaces. And so that was the brief essentially for Rios when we got involved. And in the upper right-hand corner, we'll come full circle back to the fountain. But there was a fountain near the top of the park. It's about an 80-foot grade change from the top to the bottom. And for many people, they just said, let's just wipe the slate. Let's just clear all of this stuff out of here that's broken down. And there's all of these challenges to accessibility and all the things that Charles spoke about as the concerns that are often raised about these types of spaces. And Rios undertook a process of informing the public about really the urban design bones of both what existed and off to stage left here above the park is the Music Center Plaza, which I'll show you next. And then above that is LA Department of Water and Power. And so there was this kind of really important axial relationship down from the Acropolis of these cascading series of water features and formal spaces, then bringing you to the base of City Hall. So helping the general public understand these kind of urban design bones about what would make the place successful, but also what those symmetries and axial relationships, how important all of those were. And in workshopping what pieces of the program and existing park would coalesce into the new park, the workshops were organized around really hands-on activities. And so there were existing pieces that people could put on the board and say, yeah, let's retain these aspects. And then there were all these fun new things that they could consider and see how they all related. These are examples of community-built parks. And what really came through from this process was the incredible diversity of Los Angeles and how we might express that in the park. Over 220 different languages spoken across the county. And the ultimate plan, a color version here in the lower right, kept that axial symmetry, kept the water feature, but allowed this incredible proliferation of botanical precincts that speak to the different homelands of the people of Los Angeles, and created these really welcoming gardens, civic gardens for people to inhabit on a daily basis, but then to with spaces for really significant cultural events, programming, music, should say it's stewarded by the Music Center. So that, of course, is critical to this elevated role of programming in Grand Park. And then, of course, it's at the foot of City Hall. So it's our most significant democratic space as well. So whether it's the Women's March or Inauguration Day, all those types of things, this is where we come together. And so back to the fountain, it, of course, was able to be saved, and with Jim Garland from Fluidity's help, reinvented as a more sustainable water feature, but still such a focal point and something that has become, as Zev Yaroslavsky at that time county supervisor said, one of the park's biggest draws. It really is like the magic in Grand Park, and that is part of the role of preservation, is what are those gems and what are those alignments and axes and things that can retain that sense of the feeling and association. And then the second one, this is now just uphill from Grand Park, is Music Center Plaza. And again, so like rattling off some of the challenges that we face there, you can see the stairs and the accessibility challenges associated with that. There's a large art piece, Peace on Earth, that was right in the middle of the fountain, in the middle of the plaza. The Music Center said, you know, we usually just serve people who park underneath and go to our events in the Chandler Pavilion and the Taper Forum, but we want a place where everybody can enjoy the arts, similar to the mission of Wyatt Square for the Performing Arts in Houston. We want to do this outside. We want to make it really flexible. And you can see immediately that its existing condition would really compromise the ability to use it in all the ways that the Music Center intended and be able to serve all of these new audiences that they had in mind. And so some of the challenges with doing that beyond the topographic, figuring out how to make it accessible to everybody, there were really interesting formal structures in place, 2 different column grids to the adjacent, the Mark Taper Forum and the Chandler Pavilion. And even the tree grid was not matching either of them either. And we had to use the same tree pits because the tree pits were already set into the slab over the parking structure. And so the design effort here was to envision a new kind of what we call the paving carpet that could cinch together and integrate and assimilate these different column grids and the tree pits into a new texture that felt appropriate, had that feeling and association, learning from some of the interiors by Tony Duquette and the architecture by Welton Beckett. And this is, I've got about 2 minutes left, so buzz through this. And so here you can see the final outcome right before the pandemic. We were fortunate to get this one opened up. And a couple of key things then. The art piece has been, Peace on Earth was relocated, still on its important axis between DWP and City Hall, but out of the middle so that that water feature can be turned on or turned off to support the range of community events and cultural programming that the Music Center wants to put on. Back up one more time. And the other really significant thing here was bringing that ground plane all up to one consistent elevation so that the water feature now, rather than sunk in a pit, shoots up through an elevated surface. All of this paving is on a framework, a platform, and the trees as well. The trees go down through to their tree pits. But now on this surface, everybody can enjoy it. One common elevation available to all and accessible to all is really important to the mission of the Music Center, and really, we believe, to making a successful public space. So this is just that view down from the Music Center. Again, this kind of the Acropolis, all of the importance of the sequence of spaces, the flow between them, and then selectively retaining and protecting and recontextualizing the gems that remain. All right, thanks everybody. Right on my little timer. Stop.
Thank you, Nate. That was Perfect. And I like the way you paid attention to the time. Welcome back, Charles and Gretchen. I was just going through some of these Q&A. We have a lot of activity, and I know Gretchen and I have been busy trying to get this worked up. Thank you both for those wonderful presentations. And John decided to do it. We wanted to, if you can see us on at the desk.
Oh, did we lose Chris?
Did I freeze?
Oh, you're back. Okay, you're on.
I froze. That's because you said I hadn't froze for a long time. I'm unstable, says my internet. Anyway, this is a new thing called immersive view in Zoom. If you can't see it, then you need to upgrade our conference. But I'll go ahead and start with a question. Nate, I wanted to ask you, you showed the Palm Springs Plaza, and you know there's a controversy right now going on about the Maryland statue, right?
You're not going to do that to me, are you?
You know I was going to ask about it. You don't have to say if you're in for it or not, but maybe what I like to do is to let people know that a lot of our friends in Palm Springs are working on this issue, including Trina Turk and Chris Menrad. And there is a petition going around, you know, because the statue, we'll say it in, you know, in general, like, is, you know, objectively a statue is being put in a place on a plaza, and not everyone agrees with the artwork and the placement of said artwork. What is your experience in terms of these historic plazas? And by the way, that work you did in LA is amazing. I grew up with that landscape, and that is astonishing, that the work you did there. But how do you see maybe the public reception and back and forth about these kind of artistic issues? How do you resolve that historically?
So a little bit of context there. Maryland has come and gone from Palm Springs. I think at some point, Anne.
It's like 40 feet tall, right? I guess we should tell people who haven't been there. This is like huge.
Her skirt is blowing up, and a lot of stuff that maybe in this era we might no longer consider. It's definitely not Me Too friendly. It's a real piece. But there are backers who say it'll be really magnetic and draw lots of people. Our strategy was to Aikido it a bit at first. We actually suggested an alternate location that we thought would still attract people to downtown, but not put it front and center right in line with the art museum. But ultimately, that's where folks have the people who are, and they're saying it's temporary, they're going to test it, but they're putting it in a spot that will be very visible. But I think, you know, they could have put it off center at least and still met their goals.
Yeah, I saw the plan that and it looked at, you know, there was more of a compromise, I thought, in that landscape plan. And now it just seems to be like, here it is, and this is how we're doing it. And apparently they've already set up a concrete pad, and that thing now it's in lawsuits. But anyway, if you're interested in that topic, all you have to do is type in Me Too Maryland Palm Springs, and you'll see everything you need to find out about that one. Also, there's a petition going around on it. So I know, Gretchen, you had some questions based on what we've just heard.
I do. I'd love to hear from both of you on this, but maybe let's start with Charles. What do you see are the major differences between the goals of the 1970s era urban design and the realities of public space today?
Gotcha. Okay, sorry. So I don't know if this question really is unique to the 70s. I mean, I think, at least in terms of landscape, I think what a lot of these places have in common, whether the plazas are from the 50s like Mellon, or the 60s like the earlier chain of open space work of Halprin, or the things we're looking at today, right up to the 1999 project by Dan Kiley in Pittsburgh, what they often all had in common is they suffered neglect. Yes, the earlier work before the ADA had its own unique level of accessibility challenges. And a lot of these places were very inward looking and fortified. That's something that continued until we really saw the reclaiming of cities. I would say that the things that are different, I mean, the thing that's interesting to me now today is that the way that we go about this work is very different in that, number one, you know, there are a lot of landscape historians with PhDs running around today. I mean, Nate Cormier was able to address Skyline Park because of Ann Komara's book. As he showed us in his drawings, the Howells documentation. And if we really want to peel a project back and we think about a big tent today, and I have been, someone that I would finger point at myself here, we need to tell the stories beyond the person, Lawrence Halprin, that we have to remember that this park was largely designed by a person who was in a Japanese internment camp, Sat Nishita. The person that oversaw the plantings was Gene Walton. So here's a landscape architect who's one of the founding principals in Halprin's office, who's doing the planting designs for many of these celebrated projects. So she's not working on cute little gardens, which is where she started with Halprin, but she's working in cities. And so this idea of thinking more about the context, and also I think in this era, we're also looking at sort of the sort of tail end of urban renewal. And so the other piece of this is, like, when I look at a project like Skyline Park today, and I think about Nate's closing words of recontextualizing the gems, which is why projects like Grand Park and LA Music Center rock my world as contemporary interventions. What I want to see from Rios and from that project is I want to see a recontextualizing of those gems, because to me, those remnant bits, if you will, those fountains that are part of the 20% that you speak of, Nate, to me, they're as important as the DNF Tower. And we can actually bracket and tell the story of urban renewal in a city like Denver, which urban renewal was not kind to, where it wasn't kind to modernism. And whether it was the convention center or the hyperbolic dome that was designed by Philip Johnson, that this is an opportunity to, as you said, to recontextualize the gems. And I think we have an opportunity today where there's a level of sophistication that practices like Rios are bringing, who are, yes, addressing the programmatic requirements and the deficiencies that you spoke of in your question, Gretchen. But I think that there's a higher level of sophistication that is allowing us to move away from a tabula rasa approach of earlier work.
Thanks, Charles. And Nate, I'm curious, as a designer, kind of what do you see the biggest differences are between these two eras in sort of contemporary?
So I'm going to layer on a bit to what Charles suggested, and definitely needs a shout out to Anne, both the Annes, Anne Mullins and Anne Komara, been really important sort of project whisperers to date. But the urban renewal, for example, it isn't just the design of the park. Like, they did a terrible job with the streets. The way the buildings meet the park isn't successful. So there's a whole suite of things that are part of the reason why, when Charles says things were neglected, it wasn't just like the design of the park that set something up for neglect. The fact that there were no sidewalks, those types of larger scale urban design, urban planning decisions were influential on why some of these spaces were deemed unsuccessful. And so I think hopefully part of what we're able to do today is to address design with those broader contexts, so that we're thinking about the edges more successfully. We're thinking about multimodality. We're thinking about equity. We're thinking about more dimensions of success that then hopefully the physical form, the vessel for the types of experiences people want to have there is also, successful, but it needs that broader functionality that we're able to bring to it. So, and then just very specifically topography. I think now, and we can talk about accessibility, but that's only one part of it. There's like intuitive wayfinding. There's a sense of porosity to spaces. Interestingly, I went back and read Holly White's critique of Bryant Park. He was writing at the same time that Halprin and others were creating these like immersive wonderland, like off the street, going and doing all these things. So I would love to have been a fly on the wall on some of the like debates that might have happened back then. I'm sure Charles will find a way to dig them up. But essentially, there are basic things about Prospect Refuge and feeling a sense of safety and comfort and knowing where you're going, that these sunken plazas really take a lot of extra attention to overcome those challenges. And it's not just getting the ramps down and in, it's about your sense of, comfort in spaces. So just put that out there, that nowadays I suspect we'll at least look to achieve most of the circulation. Even like Atongva Park in here where I live in Santa Monica is very dynamic topographically, but you're not going to see a decision to like take someone down as much as you'll see other things erupt and move up to create that diversity of experiences.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Nate. I'm going to take us back to Los Angeles, my hometown. So we did get a question from Shane about the perspectives on Pershing Square. So Pershing Square, if you're not familiar with it in the audience out there, is a pretty large park. There's an interesting video about it. It's across the street from the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA, and it's gone through a couple of manifestations for sure. When I was in Los Angeles, it went through a postmodern phase, and I guess there's plans now to change that yet again. So Charles, do you have anything to say about like do you think that the existing features should be retained as renovation plans go forward in this public space?
This is one of those stories of a landscape that most people love to hate. And I know that it's enormously successful when the market is going. One of the positions we've taken at TCLF is we think that it's an important landscape to be documented, that, there's a lot of ways in which this landscape does not function today for the city. And because it is, what's interesting to me is when you contextualize it within the Hannah Olin body of work, it is a really rare, pure postmodernist project. So I think at a minimum, there should be, house level documentation for the work because it is such an important practitioner. But, one of the expressions I often use is, would I fall on my sword for that landscape? And this may be controversial, but the answer is no, I would not. And, but I do think that there should be a contextual analysis. I'll leave it to the design team to make a determination of whether or not there are elements that could have a transformative value in a new design undertaking. I haven't looked at it closely enough, but it's certainly worthy of a high level of documentation. Nate, what do you think?
I was taken by the French accent when he said a radical flatness. I was like, oh, I'm done. Agence Terre won the competition, and they had just this like just the simplicity. And what's interesting, this is like, Christopher Hawthorne always talks about like LA 1.0, 2.0, he calls this like 3.0, so that reminds us that what's there now isn't like it wasn't there forever. And there was a Pershing Square before that was very functional and in the desire to, or would be in many ways, something someone might want to fall on their sword for. But the putting the parking structure underneath created the topographic challenges that are part of why it doesn't work today. And so that was, I think, a bold proposal from Agence Terre to say, even if it's going to cost you because it will, it adds like 50 million to the construction, it takes a floor of the parking away, which is important revenue for the Parks Department, and a bunch of headaches, but the simplicity of what they were essentially putting back to the earlier, maybe it's a Beaux-Arts version. It was like, yeah, God, that would be so much better to have that downtown. So.
And Nate, something you triggered also is if we do think of it as 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, it was an early example of an underground parking garage with a park deck. And so when you think about a city like Los Angeles, which was all about the romance with your automobile and being able to look out the window and see it, there was a level of innovation from the earlier design before it was redesigned. So maybe that's part, Laurie Olin uses the term centers of energy to describe landscapes that are going to be redesigned every 25 years. And maybe this is one of those spaces.
One more question, squeeze it in.
I'm very quiet.
I think Chris might have froze. I think we need to wrap it up. We're at 1 o'clock already. John or Chris, do you want to wrap it up? I hate to stop you two.
She's frozen. We had a Medusa moment with her. She was so spellbound.
That's why there's three of us here. So I'll fill in for Chris to close out. So I just wanted to thank everybody for today's role in today's program, especially our two speakers today, and Gretchen for helping co-moderate with us today. This is
I'm
the
back.
final. Oh, she's back.
You
Isn't that
froze.
funny? Right at the end, boom! I got chopped off. You
Right.
roll it up. You wrap it up, John. You're doing a good job.
Okay. So we have to finish up here. I just wanted to paste into the chat box a link to leave feedback. And then this is the last of a 3-part program. So we will be posting the recordings online on YouTube, and the recording should already be up on Facebook. Leave feedback. Okay, we also wanted to tell everybody our conference is starting on June the 8th. We will be offering ASLA units this year for the conference. So for those of you who are landscape architects, we encourage you to look into the list of programs to see if it interests you. The conference page is at californiapreservation.org/conference. And I will leave it to Chris to say a few words of thanks to both our partners and sponsors in this program.
Sure. Thank you for making me a little bit bigger on the desk. It was like a little miniature right there. I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I really appreciated your input. And I wanted to mention that Charles is one of the first people ever who helped me understand cultural landscapes. Many years ago, took me on a tour of a couple of places. And ever since then, it's just been a love ever since. So thank you, Charles. And thank you to Cultural Landscape Foundation for partnering with us on this series, and also U.S. Modernist Radio for being one of our sponsors. So we are actually going to hide for the next month and come back on June 8th with a whole new set of programs for our conference. And Gretchen will be joining us, so that's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in about a month.